My name is Amy Cow, and I want to speak in this hour on expectations of privacy in the data age. And given what we just heard from Albert, I think it's pretty clear how important data is, right? As he said over and over again, once you give the data to the doctors, you see improvement, you see the quality improve that you need to have happen. What I'm actually going to talk about is the flip side, the data that you don't want to be public, the data that you think should be private. And what I want to do today is challenge what we think about privacy, what we think about data use, and then explore what that looks like within legal frameworks. As you know, I am a practicing lawyer, so part of what I do is talk about data use and data privacy on a day-to-day basis. I want to talk about it both from the US framework, as well as looking at how Europe has approached data, which is vastly different from how we do it in the United States. By way of background, I do currently work at Catalina Marketing Corporation. For those that have ever been to the States, when you buy something at a grocery store, sometimes a coupon prints out next to your receipt. And that coupon is not random. So Catalina is the company that puts out those coupons, and what we actually do is, based on what you bought that day, based on what we know you bought before, we anticipate what you think you might want to buy. So let's say you are someone who buys Coca-Cola. You regularly buy Coca-Cola twice a week. You go to the grocery store, you buy it, and then for a couple of weeks you stop. So what Catalina does is say, okay, well, you used to buy Coke all the time, and now we're noticing you're no longer buying Coke. So what happened? Right? We try to anticipate, based on your data, is it because you are on a diet and you no longer want to drink regular Coke, so we give you a coupon for Diet Coke, right? Or we say, well, maybe you no longer want caffeinated beverages, so then we give you Sprite coupons. The idea is it's the data that powers that. And the question is, in an age when we say data is mine, is that data that should be out there for consumption generally? Scott McNealy, who is the founder of Sun Microsystems, famously said, "You have zero privacy anyway, so just get over it." Now, the question I want to have all of you think about is, do you think you have privacy over your data? Do you think you ought to have privacy over your data? I'm going to make this a very interactive discussion because this is a field that's constantly evolving, and I think it's important for all of you to think about what this means for your lives. It is continuing to evolve, and it will continue to evolve. By show of hands, how many people here actually study law? Okay, a handful. Business. Wow, okay, overwhelming. This is going to come into play a lot, okay? I started off as mostly doing corporate law, working with a lot of companies, negotiating against countries, stuff like that. And when I moved into the corporate world, this is what we talk about day in and day out. What do we do with data? How do we protect it? So the questions we really want to think about is, right, the title was Expectations of Privacy in the Digital Age. Number one, what is the digital age? Right, and I think most of you in this room are young enough that you don't remember when telephones came out, right? When cell phones were not that common, right? But back then, and that's only a few decades ago, that was considered really advanced and really digital, right? And the idea was, wow, I can talk to someone without being face to face. And we are now in a world in which you can speak to someone halfway across the world by phone, by email, via Facebook, right? They're all very, very common ways of interacting, but what does that mean for us, right? Privacy. What are we talking about when we say privacy? Does that mean no one touches it? Does that mean they only touch it how you want it? And then the third is, what does that look like, both in the United States as well as in the EU? So when I talk digital, I'm talking about a lot of different things, right? No one usually thinks about the bank as being a digital thing, right? But banks have more information about you than most other places, right? They have your well, in the United States, they have your social security number, they have your identification number, they have access to all of your funds, right? But the list goes on and on. Think about these things in terms of what information is being passed back and forth, right? GPS. The GPS, most of us actually use an app on our phones now, it knows where you're going, it knows when you're going, it knows when you're going to get there. It goes on and on, right? Web-based maps, travel itineraries, the internet. The internet's a huge one, right? We're talking about When you email someone, I don't know how many people use Gmail, right? Google and Gmail, they know so much about you. And the former CEO of Google, who's now the CEO of one of their subsidiaries, he famously said that as long as we're not doing evil, it's okay. So they're cool having all of your data and doing whatever it is they want, but part of the reason most of us don't care is because it makes our lives more efficient, right? If I can open an email in my Gmail account that says that I have something that needs to happen tomorrow, and press a button and it automatically populates onto my calendar, I'm really happy with that, right? But when it goes in deeper, right, how many of you have done online shopping and then you decide not to buy something, and then suddenly there's a banner on the right side of your screen that gives you an ad for that exact thing? It's a little creepy, right, that they know exactly what you just went shopping for. But that's part of targeted advertising, targeted marketing. It goes on and on, the list of things that I think are part of what we have in this digital age. And I think the last one, drones. We're not quite there yet, right? But everyone is talking about what does it mean to have privacy in an age where there are drones, right? When people can have aerial views of what you're doing and they're not necessarily extremely regulated. What does that look like for all of us? Okay, so privacy is an abstract concept. My animation went backwards. This was supposed to come last. But okay, so privacy is the idea that we are free from unwanted or undue intrusion or disturbance into your private life or affairs. How many people think that's an accurate description? Yep, I see some nods. Okay. There is a US Supreme Court case and Harvard Law Review article that actually says privacy is just the idea that you can be let alone. Like, people will not bother you. You can do whatever you want privately, and that's your call, right? I apologize that this is covering it. And it's also the idea that you can be free from damaging publicity, public scrutiny, secret surveillance, unauthorized disclosure of your data. But the reason why I have this icon on top of it is because when we think about privacy, right, we all think about ourselves, and we think, well, I'm a good actor, right? The things that I do in private should be kept private. But there are certain people in our societies that we think that what they do in private should not be kept private, right? Any ideas who I'm talking about? In the back. Yes. And that is on everyone's mind these days, right? You have a terrorist. Does a terrorist have a right to privacy? Right? What they're doing in private, shouldn't that be exposed for the sake of the greater good? So the social concept of privacy generally, right, was, at least in the United States mostly, it's the idea of home, and that where your home is where things are private, and anything that's outside of your home is no longer private, it's public. But in this age where we can go outside of our homes without physically leaving, what does that mean? Right? It used to be the concept of trespass. So if I go into your house, I have then infringed upon your private space, right? Think of it as a private sphere. And once I've infringed upon that, I've infringed upon your privacy, unless you give me the right to do that. Right? So that's the idea of trespass, authorized access to one's home. I'm not going to bore you with all of it because it's mostly a legal thing, and most of you are business people. But that's the concept of privacy historically. Wiretapping was one of the first things that came into place as something that, quote unquote, violated people's privacy. And in the United States, there is regulation on wiretapping in every single state, but it differs in every single state. So in Massachusetts, you can only wiretap someone if they know you're wiretapping them, which kind of makes it ineffective, right? If you tell someone I am tapping your phone, they're no longer going to say anything you want to hear, right, when you're tapping their phone. But there are other states in the United States where you don't have to tell them. And as long as one party knows it, it's okay. But this was the first time where people tried to invade into the home space without actually being there. So privacy, I think, is addressing these 4 basic questions. And this is the kind of stuff you have to answer every time you raise a privacy question. The first is, what are you trying to protect? Right? What is the data? So I think it's very different to protect, for example, pictures of my dog versus pictures of my kid. Right? I have a different level of sensitivity to one versus the other, right? But then the question is, what are you protecting it from, right? Is it because you don't want someone to sell it? Is it because you don't want anyone to have it? Is it because you don't want someone to do something with it, right? From whom are you protecting it, right? Who are the bad people that you don't want to have your data? And then whose responsibility is it to make sure that your data doesn't get out there? Is it yours because it's your data? Is it the internet service provider because you put it online? Or is it the person on the other end who you emailed it to? They should know they're not supposed to forward it on to anybody else. So in general, when we talk about privacy protection, the stuff we're talking about is personal information, confidential information, and private information. These are all very, very broad definitions, right? What does it mean to have personal information? Anybody name one thing that's personal information that you may or may not want somebody to know? Secrets, okay. Email password, that's a good one. How about your name? Do you want people to know your name? Sometimes, yeah, exactly. I think that's going to be the answer for most of this, sometimes, right? Do you want people to know your address, your phone number? Yeah, right, it's kind of, you don't necessarily want everybody to have it, but you want your circle of friends to have it, right? But then, and we'll get to that, when we talk about this digital age, who is within that circle of friends and how much control do you have over who has that access? And then the four things, right, when you think about what is it protected from, right, you don't want people to use it, right, like I don't want someone calling me if I don't know them, right, but I also don't want them to share it with anybody else. I'm not a big fan of, if I give my friend my phone number, they turn around and sell it to somebody, right, don't do that, that's my phone number, right, so that's monetization, I don't want it sold, and then I don't want anyone to take it, right, that's the big one. And I don't know how much it happens here in Georgia. In the United States, it's a big thing, identity theft, right? Somebody steals your credit cards, they steal your driver's license, and then they start to pretend they're you, right? And I've certainly had it happen to me where I lost my credit card, and all of a sudden, someone 5 states away is buying $500 worth of gas, they're buying plane tickets somewhere, because they were able to pretend they were me and spend all my money, right? Blocking it? Well, I didn't do it fast enough. That was the problem, right? But that's one of the things you want to protect, right? Someone stealing your stuff and using it as if it's their own. So when we talk about privacy, we were talking about keeping our stuff anonymous, right? Blocking out anything that would identify me personally, right? We're talking about fairness and control, right? That if it's my data, I have the right to control where it goes. And the third is confidentiality. And before we jump into this next slide, when we talk about privacy, there are actually 2 different flavors of privacy in the US legal understanding of privacy. Right? So the first is the to be let alone privacy. That's the idea people can't tell you what to do, you have control over your life, right? That is your private right. But then there's this separate privacy right that continues to develop in our society, which is called informational privacy. And that's where I was talking about your phone number, right? The idea that I can't go in and take a bunch of phone numbers, I can't survey all of you and take your phone numbers, put them on a list, and then do something with it, right? That's the idea that what my information is, not what I do on a daily basis, but my information is mine. So those are the 2 different flavors. That would be very consistent with, and I'll get into that, you just talked about half my slides now, but that would be very consistent with the European view, right? That government should really be playing a part in stopping things. The United States view is we don't trust government. Yeah, they're worried that government's going to do something with that data, and I don't know if that's historically because of the Revolutionary War and sort of where America came from, but there's an inherent mistrust of government in the United States. And so if you don't trust your government, who do you trust to regulate things? Right? That's sort of the outstanding question. Of course, we are concerned about competitors, right? If I own a company, I don't want my competitor to have that data, right? We worry about individuals, so that gets to the shaming and the cyberbullying. Bad actors, right? That's the terrorists of the world and others who we think are going to do bad things with our data. Famously, part of what happened as the Holocaust and World War II is that they used public records, right, to figure out who fit into which bucket and then to do things based on that. So that was a bad use of data, right? And then there's also things like future employers, right? Do you want your future employer to be able to look at your Facebook page and say, wow, this is what this person does on weekends? I don't think I want to hire them anymore, right? So there's all of that. And then the question, right, whose job is to protect it? So to your point, the government, right? But then there are the companies to whom it's entrusted, right? So that's a very US model in that we have companies, it's a free market economy, they have that data. So for example, my company, we have, how do I say this without giving you everything? We have information about what people buy at the grocery store. Literally their receipts. Like if Albert went to the grocery store today in the United States and went to one of the companies that hired us, I would know exactly what he bought. I would know he bought 2 pounds of carrots. I would know he bought a box of crackers. He bought some toys for his baby. That sort of thing. I would know that, right? But who is regulating me in terms of how I use that information? I'd like to say I regulate myself. And then we ourselves, right, our data. We have an obligation to manage our own data. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which, as a caveat, is an entity that firmly believes that we need to address our freedoms by regulating the government. They say new technologies are radically advancing our freedoms, but they're also enabling unparalleled invasions of privacy. So their concern is, as we become more digital, that our privacy is no longer within our control. And I think all of us have experienced that. So again, the same list. Right? All of these things are what constitutes our quote-unquote digital age. But as you see this list again, I want you to think about, well, what does that mean for me? Right? What does it mean that I use a GPS? So here's a question. Okay, this is a real story that happened in the United States. I work for a company, not me. This person worked for a company. Right? The company said, I want you to go deliver this particular package. There's a GPS in the car. The person uses the GPS, they go there, they come back. Does the employer have the right to that information? Yes, why? Because it's the employer's car, okay? What if the employer says, I want you to go, you use your own car, here's a GPS to get there? So all of these are the types of questions we're thinking about, right? And the one I want to talk about today, which I think is mostly relevant, because I think from the people I've talked to so far since I've gotten here, and I arrived here yesterday, I think this is probably very relevant. We're going to talk about social media, right? So as you'll see in the next presentation, Facebook is the most prevalent social media, social networking outlet in Georgia. So the question is, what happens on Facebook? And we all know Facebook has been subject to a lot of scrutiny, right, based on how they use our data. And that's changed over time. Their privacy policy has changed, but they're constantly doing things with our data. One of those things is selling your data, right? Those people who are advertising on the side, they bought your data, right? And I can tell you, because I'm in the field, that they probably bought your data at a particular premium, and then they're being charged something like 5 cents every time you look at it, 10 cents if you click it, but it adds up, right? Companies are being built on this, right? The idea is that we are being tracked, though we're not necessarily consenting to being tracked. And I would actually be curious how it works here, because there are a lot of regulations on this continent that we don't have in the United States in terms of tracking and privacy of that data. Right. Every time you do something on any of these social media sites, you are leaving a digital footprint, right? And a fingerprint as to who you are, what your interests are, who you're connected to. But does anyone else have a right to that data? So, like I talked about earlier, this is my day-to-day, and it looks really silly, right? It's a receipt. It says tomato puree, dried pineapple, chopped tomatoes, right? It seems silly, to care about what someone is doing at the grocery store, right? What they're buying. What I can tell you is you take that information, you make it valuable because you're targeting people. Most of my clients are, actually I work with all the major grocery retailers in the United States, as well as pretty much every consumer packaged good maker out there. So if you have any sort of packaged good, any kind of granola bar, cracker, cookies, I probably work for them. And what they do with all of this data is figure out who their target audience is and how they can get more traction in the market, right? And it seems like it's just, who really cares? It's just a little bit of information, but this is worth billions and billions of dollars, and that's sort of what our company is based on. Because the idea is that we end up pushing coupons. The coupons, you get 50 cents off, but they got an entire product bought, right? So this is today's world, big data. Lots of information about lots of people, actually too much information, right? The stuff that is out there on each of us, if we were to see a dossier of what's on us, I think would be huge. And the question again, who regulates it and how? So when we talk about protecting data, the first question is, who owns that data? Right? Do I own my phone number? I don't know. Do I own my phone number? If it's in the public, we have the white pages, the phone book, right? It's out there, so do I own that? It identifies me, but I don't know if I own it, right? So we have to look at things like social norms, right? What do people generally in my community think belongs to me versus belongs to the company? You look at contracts, right? What do the privacy policies say? When I post something on Facebook, does Facebook agree that it's mine or theirs? There was I'm trying to think, I think it was maybe 3 years ago on Facebook, there was this rampant thing where people started posting a disclaimer saying that what I post belongs to me. I don't know if you all saw that here. That disclaimer was people trying to say, look, if I put a piece of my art on Facebook, it still belongs to me. Facebook, you do not own my art, you don't own my photography because I posted on your website, right? Because there were claims that Facebook was making that because you posted on our website, it now belongs to us, right? And I have a cousin who is an artist, and so she said, okay, everything. She had this long disclaimer on everything. But the problem was, even though she had that long disclaimer, when she signed up for Facebook, where it says, I agree, click here, I agree, click here, she clicked all of those. Okay, show of hands, how many people read that language? Right, no one raised their hand, right? You just say, okay, I agree. I want to use this app, I want to use this website, okay, I agree. But what that language says, most of the time, in a lot of cases, is they own your data, right? The way we push that, the way we push out the privacy policies and the data use agreements is by social norms, right? If there is a lot of blowback on Facebook that people are upset, Facebook will say, okay, you know what? We don't want you to leave us. Let's change our privacy policy to account for that, okay? And then third, laws and regulations, to your point, having the government involved in what we're doing. So the question on who owns the data, right? Is exposure enough? Who says exposure is enough? No, nobody. Interesting, okay. So what's enough to own somebody else's data? When I shop at the grocery store, and I go back to this because that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. When I shop at the grocery store, we have rewards cards. I don't know if you have them here. They're frequent shopper cards. It's an ID number that says that when I go to this grocery store, I get a discount on certain things. Do I own that number? I don't know. Right? Do I own that number? And if that number is tied then to what I buy at the grocery store, do I own that? If that number is tied to my credit card, do I own that? Right? All of that is what's being raised here. So the question is, it doesn't matter how you got access, right? It's not that I went and I said, here's my credit card number, but by connecting dots, by talking to people that have my credit card number, they were able to get it, so should they have a right to it? And the last question is, do you have to have a relationship with the originator, right? So the person that has my credit card number in a database, I never talked to them. I never signed up for anything with them. Is that okay? But they still have my data. So here are the concerns, and this is broadly written, right? So if we have broad access, that's the idea that everyone has access to my information. The concern there is you've got surveillance issues, right? And that, again, speaks to sort of the US concern, but that's the idea that people are watching you. They know what you're doing because they have access to your information. But surveillance goes on to targeting, which is what my company does. Then it goes on to stalking. Then it goes on to control. And then you worry about Big Brother, right? That's the idea your government or someone else is controlling because they see everything you do, right? There is a very valid argument that Facebook needs to be regulated. And I keep going to Facebook because I know you're familiar with it. The data that you get in Facebook, the news feeds, for example, do you get all the news? The answer is no. Exactly. It's all targeted based on what they think you're interested in, right? And it's all based on what they're flowing through, right? And I'm not going to say that Facebook is bad. I don't think they sit and think, wow, I only want you to read these certain things. But when they throw it through their algorithm, right, you only get certain kinds of information. It's a skewed and biased view of the world, but that's what you get when you go through the targeting mechanism. You can't get everything. Limited access, the problem there is it's inefficient, right? If I were to say, no one has access to any of my information, I do lots of stuff online, I don't want anybody to know about it, but then no one's going to send me ads for anything. I'm not going to get any coupons, I'm not going to have any of the extra stuff. I have to go figure it out by myself every single time, instead of companies coming to me. But eventually, you worry about the fact that people can keep everything private. It goes all the way to the extreme of anarchy, right? If I could do anything I wanted to in private, nobody has any rights to it, including the government. Lots of bad things can happen because there are a lot of bad actors in our society. Okay, so what I want to dump into here is data breach. Here are the big ones, okay, that we've seen in the United States. Here's a big one. Anybody heard about the Panama Papers? Yes. Yes, right? That's what, last week? So it's offshore bank accounts, right? Mossack Fonseca, it's a law firm, right? Law firms and lawyers are subject to confidentiality and privilege obligations. So that means if you are my client, anything you tell me, at least in the United States, anything you tell me, I can't tell anybody. If you tell me that you killed somebody, technically, I can't tell anybody, right? That's privilege. So here, right, because a hacker got into their files, they were able to see who has offshore bank accounts. Now, if we are to believe the law firm, right, believe them when they say that what they did is completely legal, okay, that's fine, but people were upset, right? The Prime Minister of Iceland resigned, right, because it creates a really bad public image. So then the question is, was that data breach, that hack, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Right, this was a big one in the United States a few years back, the Snowden leak. Right, Edward Snowden was a contractor, he worked for the National Security Agency, and he went out and said, hey, guess what, guys? The United States government has all this information about you. And of course he did it as he was fleeing the country, right? The Snowden leak actually changed the way America thinks about data and the way America thinks about privacy. Right, after that happened, and actually, the Snowden leak changed the way Europe thinks about America, right? Because we all realize that the government has information about us, and that makes us nervous about the government. But what Europe realized is that the government has information about people abroad, and that they have more of a freedom to do stuff with that information than they thought they had before, right? So is that a good one? Right? How many people think, so what he said is, here's some information about the way the United States does national security, and he just sort of put it out there for the public. Good or bad? How many people think it's good? Why do you think it's good? Public information? Well, one reason people say it's good is because he exposed that the United States had this information. Right, so that people should know if there's information being collected on them. Right? Bad? Anybody think it's bad? Right, well, the reason it's bad, the United States lost its confidentiality on a bunch of stuff, right? And now there's a question of national security when that information is now freely flowing. Right, so you have to balance those values. Right, how many of you use the lock screen on the front of your iPhone? How many of you care if someone else could get onto your phone? Okay, so what we've seen in the United States is a huge fight, right, between Apple, the company that makes your iPhone, and the United States. The federal government has a right, and it's under the All Writs Act, not that any of you need to know it, from what is it? It's from a long, long time ago. The All Writs Act from 1798, I believe, which basically says the federal court system can issue a writ, and they can say, I demand this information because it is important for what we are doing in our country. It's a very broad ask. And they've used it many, many times on Apple in the past 2 years. Actually, 11 times they've used it. And the biggest time, the most famous one that they've used it in this past year, was we had a terrorist incident in California, in San Bernardino, right? And they used an iPhone. How many of you know about the Apple versus US on this? Yes, can you tell us about it briefly? So Apple's main concern is to prove to the world that your data is safe and your iPhone is safe, no matter what's on that iPhone, right? Yes? I'm sorry? Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. But the idea was, when you have this lock screen, and I've never had this happen because I usually remember my password, if you don't know the password and you try it 10 times, it locks, right? And it actually should wipe out your phone, is the theory. And what the United States FBI said is, we need to unlock these people's phones because they did this thing, and we think there's data on there about who they're connected to, and we want to track them down. And what Apple said is, no, we can't let you hack into our phone because that's people's personal information. It's encrypted, and we don't want you in there. And so there was a huge fight back and forth, right? Whose right is it? Does the United States government have a right to that data in the interest of national security? Apple says no, right? In the end, they didn't even need to go through the fight because the United States was able to find someone to hack into the phone and figure it out themselves. But it raises the question, right? Where do you draw the line, right? Apple said, well, if we let you do this, you're going to do this for anybody. And you have to wonder, is that the case or is it not? Right? You deal with the tension between national security and encryption. So what I think we've established here, there were enough people saying good, bad, that expectations of privacy are really, really hazy, right? What is the quote-unquote norm and what you can expect from your society, from your companies, from your legal system, it's all very, very hazy in terms of what privacy is, right? There are different standards based on who's accessing the data, right? If it's another individual, maybe I think one thing. If it's a government, I think it's another thing. If it's companies, it's another thing, right? So how we approach it is all very, very different, and it constantly is changing, right? The more you become digital, the more you become interconnected, the more it's not just inviting people into your home, but inviting them to be your friend, right, on Facebook. Your data is out there. And how do we control that, and how do we think about what's mine and what's not mine? So James Whitman, who's a Yale law professor, said something which I think it's very valid, right? He says that privacy law is not the product of logic. We can't sit here and just think about it, right? It's not even a product of experience. I mean, I think our experiences will inform it, but it's not enough, right? It's the product of local social anxieties and local ideals. So in the United States, like I talked about earlier, most of those anxieties, as he says, right, they focus on the police. They focus on the government and not wanting to be controlled, right? And the ambition to just have a country based on liberty, right? While here, right, in Europe, most of it is focusing actually on the concept of dignity. The idea that what I put out there, if it is shameful or can be used in a shameful way to tarnish my reputation, then it shouldn't be out there to begin with. Right? The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about privacy. Why? Because in Europe, privacy is a human right. It is not a human right in the United States. It is not something that is unconditionally protected versus here where it is. So running through a general comparison, right, when we think about the two of them, the United States is all about market efficiency. Market efficiency at the cost of individuals is fine, right? Versus here, where privacy is a human right, and privacy, information about you, is not a commodity. It cannot just be sold, right? When we look about how privacy is defended, right here we talk about government, we talk about restrictions. In the United States, there is not one concerted way of dealing with privacy issues. As a result, most of privacy issues are dealt with by suing each other. I'm upset someone has my data, I sue them. It's a very American thing to do. Okay. Opt-in, opt-out. How many people get spam messages in your email? Everybody, right? But in Europe, the rule is opt-in, right? You're supposed to, at least that's the rule, have to opt in to get something before you get it. In the United States, we have, I think, 10 times as much spam because the rule is opt-out. People can sign you up for anything they want to sign you up for, and you just have to click the button that says, I don't want this. But after a while, you get tired of it and hopefully filter it into your junk box, right? Here, there's an express consent that's required. In America, it's assumed consent. Second thing, PII. That stands for personally identifiable information, right? That's your phone number, that's your address, it's your name. In Europe, PII encompasses most everything. So when I was talking about the frequent shopper card number, when you go to the grocery store, that here is considered private information that cannot be shared. In the United States, there is very little PII that is considered sensitive, that is considered something that cannot be resold. So name and address is actually on the fence as to whether or not it can be resold. Things that actually matter to Americans are things like my health information. Right? If I go to a hospital and I'm on certain medication, that should not be public information. Right? If I see certain kinds of doctors because I have a particular problem, that should not be public information. That is sensitive PII in America. But stuff like your grocery shopper card, not private at all. Okay? And what we see here in Europe is that, and part of this has to do with the way the EU has controlled things through the Data Privacy Act, is it's all centralized, right? Those that are in the EU are required to have a national data protection authority, so that's an agency that's required to do the regulation, and they're also required to have a data protection law. Centralized, unified, one thing. In the United States, because we are trying to do market efficiency, it's been piecemeal, and it's been address things as they come up. So you'll see there are a lot of holes in the way we do things in the United States because it is this kind of fractured thing. On top of that, because we have federalism, right, so federalism is the idea that we have in the United States one national government, but we have 50 states that have state governments that are also sovereign. There are rules in certain states that are different from the entire rest of the country, right? Like we talked about wiretapping, those sorts of things. How many of you think that your data stays within the walls of your country? Right, not anymore, right? How many of you think that your data stays within the continent? How many of you would be surprised if I told you that your data probably goes to India and is processed there? No surprise at all, right? How about Southeast Asia? So your data is out there, right? It's everywhere. And what happened with the Snowden leak, right, when everyone in the world realized that the US government's collecting information on people, was that Europe got very, very antsy. For many years, we've been operating with data that goes from the United States to Europe and from Europe to the United States under what's called the Safe Harbor Act. That's the idea that I, as a US company, can certify that I keep your data secure. I'm not going to tell you how I keep it secure. I'm just going to tell you I adhere to the standards and your data is safe with me. That's been the rule forever, right? When the Snowden leak happened, because everyone was antsy, they actually did away with Safe Harbor. Safe Harbor is gone. If anyone tells you they rely on Safe Harbor, don't listen to them. Okay, what's now being worked out is something called Privacy Shield. And that is still, the details of that are still being worked out. But the idea is that people now need to follow in the United States something that's much closer to the European model, right? The model in which I have to know what's being done with my data. I need to know who's touching it, right? So if I send it to one company that sends it to another, I as a consumer have a right to that information. Secondarily, if someone in Europe gives their data out and it ends up in the United States somehow, you now have a right to go into the United States, and actually it's on the dime and being paid for by the United States, to go in and sue them if you think your data is not being used properly. And the United States government has an obligation to help you do that, right? And that's in order to continue to secure this cross-border thing, because we in the United States realize that we cannot do international business without Europe, okay? Greater transparency for everybody. So here is an abbreviated list of US privacy regulations. And like I said, in the United States, there is not a centralized way of dealing with privacy. So you'll see the first one I listed, that's the Federal Trade Commission. That is the closest thing we have in the United States to a data or privacy protection commission, the closest thing. But actually their entire focus is just consumer privacy. That's the idea when you buy something, people shouldn't have information about you. They shouldn't be able to track your demographics, know what you make, right, what your salary is, that sort of thing. That's all the FTC does. But they're the closest thing we have to an entity that regulates everything. The next thing that has the most teeth is the Fourth Amendment. That's the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, and we'll jump into that more. But after that, you'll see there's a whole host of things, right, ways in which we talk about protecting information in the United States that, like I said, is piecemeal. Right, so the Privacy Act of 1974 talked about the government has to have fair information practices. But then 9/11 happened, right? And when 9/11 happened, we said, okay, well, we actually want to give the government more rights in terms of having information about what people are doing because, as the gentleman in the back said, we're worried about terrorists. So the Patriot Act happened. And the Patriot Act actually says that the government has more rights on digital surveillance. They have more rights to know what's going on your phones, computers, all of that, than they did before because we're concerned about national security. Right, so those two are the biggest government ones. But then you get onto the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's the idea that people can't just use your data to determine your credit, right? Because most of Americans have a lot of debt, right? When they buy houses, they take out a lot of loans. The right to get that credit, right, is based on your credit score, but it's also based on information about you. So people can't start selling your data, right? HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That's the idea that your health information that your insurance company gets is not public information, right? In fact, if you've ever spoken to a doctor in the US and you ask about someone or something, they're not allowed to even tell you if someone is their patient, right? Because of this kind of concern over health information. But again, all piecemeal, right? Here, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. That's the idea that websites that collect information from kids are subject to higher regulations. It goes on and on, right? Banking regulations, video, and we even have a regulation for driver's license information. So the state departments that collect your information in order to get a driver's license, they are subject to regulation on your data. But again, this is not unified. This is sort of all over the place. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Fourth Amendment is actually the clearest thing we have in the United States in terms of data use. Does anybody know what the Fourth Amendment says? I wouldn't expect you to. Actually, most Americans don't know what the Fourth Amendment says. Okay, the Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That's the idea the government cannot just enter your home and take your stuff, right? If you've ever watched any of these American crime shows, right, where there's police and they come and search, they do things like convince someone to let them in or whatever, to take data, right, to take evidence about the crime. What we have in the Fourth Amendment is the requirement that we cannot be subject to unreasonable search and seizure. If someone unreasonably searches and seizes something from your home and uses it to try and bring claim against you in a court of criminal law, the answer is no. Right? Under US evidence law, it's wiped out. You pretend it didn't exist. right? So even though I went into your house and I found the gun, right, and I found a note that you wrote that said, I killed the person, I don't have a right to that information because I did it unreasonably, right? So take all of this and move it into the digital realm, right? What does it mean to, quote unquote, unreasonably search someone's information? So you'll see, because we like political cartoons. These are all, and I could go on, political cartoons about the Fourth Amendment, right? So in this one, it's hard to read. This police officer says, we're supposed to knock and announce, right? And the other person, because it says Fourth Amendment privacy rights. And the second guy says, yeah, sure, but the Supreme Court says we don't have to, right? So there's the question of what is the rule in terms of when can you get in, when can you get information? And this one down here is a police officer saying, oh no, he's got a lock on us with his cell phone because it says no unreasonable searches and seizures. That's the Fourth Amendment. What we've determined in common law, because the United States is a common law country, right, based on case law, based on lots of arguments before the Supreme Court, is that what unreasonable search and seizure means that you will have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Can anyone articulate for me what a reasonable expectation of privacy is? No, right? Because as we talked about, privacy is hazy. People's expectations are hazy, and they're based on whatever the social norm happens to be at the time, whatever technology happens to be at the time. And then there's this question, and if any of you ever have any interest in going to law school in America, we talk about this for months. What is reasonable, right? My rationale could be different from the next person's, right? What I think is reasonable and okay is different from the next person's. So determining what is reasonable, what the reasonable person would think, is something that's subject to a lot of case law in determining how you figure that out. So sadly enough, there's still no clear rule in the United States. The rule is do what's reasonable. The government can do what's reasonable, you should expect what's reasonable, and we all go from there. So it doesn't really leave us with answers. Okay, so this is the world in which we currently live, right? Everything is connected, right? Your data is out there, right? The stuff you post on Facebook is out there. I am not tech savvy enough to have put enough privacy filters on my Facebook account, so my stuff is probably out there too, right? But in this kind of age, I think it behooves all of us to think about what is happening to our data, what is being used with it, what is it being used for, sorry, and should it happen that way? And I think as all of you, many of you are in the business field, I think it's worth it as you embark on your careers to think about what data will you be using, how will you be using it, and what things will you put in place? Because actually data is one of the most valuable things out there. Right? One of the initiatives I work on day to day is how can we monetize our data? Because people are willing to spend billions upon billions of dollars for data on things like what you bought at the grocery store. So extrapolate that to bigger things, right? More important things, phone numbers, addresses, names, and it becomes even more valuable. But what are you going to do as business leaders in terms of regulating that and taking care of it? So I actually want to just leave some time now for questions. I'm not sure that I'll have answers because clearly there are no answers for privacy, but I'm happy to field any questions you may have about the legal system in the United States and how we address data privacy or privacy in general. So your question is, in the Apple versus United States case, why did they put it out there that this debate was happening? Part of it is Americans are fascinated with transparency, right? They want to be able to see everything that's happening. So our court system is fairly open, right? So everything that happens in the court, any order of the court, becomes public information. So what happened in that case is the United States requested it of Apple. Apple said no. And so the United States went to the court and said, we want you to order them to do it. So as soon as that order happened, it became public information what they were asking for. I think there is still a lot of debate, actually, where people don't understand what it is the United States was asking for. Apple says, you're asking us to go down a slippery slope of opening up everyone's data to everybody. And the United States said, no, we're looking for this one phone because of this one incident only. That said, the United States has asked for it 11 times in different incidences, right? They were denied access with a New York drug case recently. So the answer is different every time, but the reason it went public is because of the way we view our legal system, and that it's everyone's knowledge. to know what's going on. So when we're talking about Facebook in particular, I'm a firm believer in reading the privacy policy, making everything as private as you can. I am also a firm believer of the data is mine to give in the beginning, so if you don't want it out there, don't put it out there. That's my personal rule, right? And I don't make friends on Facebook with people I don't know, right? Because I don't know what they're going to do with my information. As a lawyer, I would say read the privacy policy, but I think nobody reads it. I sometimes read it, but I don't have time to read every privacy policy I run into. I don't know what the Georgian law is on this. I can tell you in Europe, if you want to know, for EU countries, you can demand to know, and they are required to tell you where your data is going. So the likes of Facebook and others have to say, your data is being transferred from here to here to here. They will not tell you where it's being sold. So that's one of their, because if you read their privacy policy, it gives them pretty big leeway in terms of what they can do with it. So I would say do what you can to protect your information so it doesn't get out there if you don't want people to have it, and read stuff before you sign up for it. Most of the apps, at least in the early days, most of the apps on phones, on iPhones especially, they're games and stuff like that, but they're actually not games. They are games that are a front for data collection so that people can get information about you, resell it, target you. So be careful with those. One of the things I think is the power of social norms, right? The power that we as consumers have over companies. Because even though we could say, well, I as an individual, I can't do anything. If I want access to Facebook, I have to accept it. But if it becomes enough of an issue, like for example, that copyright issue, in terms of art that was being posted on Facebook, you can make enough of a stink together with your friends and have it keep growing that they have to listen to you. And so I think that's the way to deal with it. Or you could be like, I used to work at a law firm, and one of my partners would read those click-through agreements. He read every single one. And if he didn't like it, he just didn't accept it. So he had the most outdated software, and he had no apps on his phone, he wasn't on Facebook, he wasn't on LinkedIn, he didn't do anything because he said, I'm not gonna do that. That's one way to do it, but I think your point is you want access, right? So the idea is you build up the social momentum and you make it very clear to companies, this is what we expect, and we're gonna do something about it. And I think you have the benefit being on this continent versus the United States in that your government supports that sort of thing, and you could probably do petitions there as well to get them to push forward some of these privacy things in terms of your data.